You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ginny Choi. I am an Associate Director of the Academic and Student Programs here at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I'm also a Senior Fellow in the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, as well as a Senior Research Fellow with the Mercatus Center. I am here today with Dr. Diego Aycinena. He is currently an associate professor of economics at Universidad de Rosario in Bogota, Colombia. He's also the research affiliate at the Economic Science Institute at Chapman University. Previously, he was an assistant professor of economics at Universidad Francisco Marroquin in Guatemala, and also the director of Centro Vernon Smith, the Economia Experimental, while he was there. He earned his PhD in economics at George Mason University in 2007, where he was also a social change fellow with the Mercatus Center. Thank you so much for joining us today with us, Diego.
Thank you for having me, Ginny.
So I thought we would talk about what your experience was like here at George Mason while you're a student here. Now you're also an alum with us, so there's a very long history here already. And also talk about, I know you use experimental economics for your research, so how it kind of connects in and everything with your research here.
So my experience here was great. Now I have to put a caveat on that in the sense that looking back, I think I was not prepared for grad school when I was here. So, it took me a little while to get settled. I think I'm finally getting settled right now. So it's been a long process. But yes, I do use experiments for my research. Lately, I've been using experiments to try to better understand social norms and the role that social norms play for different institutions. So specifically, right now we have some research projects where we're trying to understand the shape of the social norm space, meaning different type of descriptive, injunctive norms, different type of perception on norms, and how that all interacts.
So it makes me wonder, right? Social norms is a very important aspect of understanding human behavior and why we choose certain things. And while other people would choose one thing, we wouldn't choose another. Why the experimental method, though? Because one might think it's not the best suited methodology for this. So why would you go use that one?
That's a great question. So partly I use it because that's one of the main tools I have, but partly because I think experiments allow us to isolate certain variables and to measure certain variables in a different way that can be done, through other tools. So anthropologists have looked at social norms for a while, mainly, using sort of participant observant type of methods. I think social norms allow us, give us a different angle, a different take on how to look at social norms and how to try to measure and capture social norms. So essentially, one of the things we do is we use kind of coordination games and try to, incentivize belief tasks to try to get at the shared perception and the beliefs that other individuals have regarding the behavior of others and the normative component that others might have towards, certain actions in a particular situation.
So for that particular research that you're describing right now, what results have you found in that particular project?
Okay, so the project is still ongoing. Right now we have data from, I believe, 8 countries.
Oh, that's
8 different
awesome.
countries.
Okay.
So we're looking at this cross-culturally. We're still collecting additional data. And one of the things we find is in that particular project, we're looking at social norms regarding cheating behavior or dishonesty across societies. So one of the things we find is social norms matter for dishonest behavior. That's perhaps not particularly surprising, but as I said before, one of the things we're trying to do is sort of like explore the shape of the norm space. So we look at both descriptive norms, meaning how individuals expect others to behave in a situation where they can be dishonest for a personal gain, and injunctive norms, meaning the shared perception about how socially appropriate or inappropriate lying or cheating behavior can be in this context. So one of the things we find is, descriptive norms matter, injunctive norms matter, but not as one would expect, just injunctive norms having a direct effect on the level of cheating. Actually, what we find is that the different types, the different perception of the normative types, meaning the people who have a perception of the norm being consequentialist, in the sense that the larger the extent of the lie, the more socially inappropriate it is, have a different behavior than people who tend to have a deontic perception of the norms, meaning that regardless of the extent of the lie, it is just equally socially inappropriate any extent of the lie. So people who have a more deontic perception of the norms, when they lie, they tend to lie to the maximal extent more than people who have a different perception of the norms.
That's actually pretty interesting, because you would think that depending on what they're lying about, like my sort of intuition is, if I'm going to lie, it may depend on whether I think it's going to be like a big thing or a small thing, and then depending on whether it's a big thing or a small thing, I might go maximal cheating if I can describe it that way, or I might do some other variant level of cheating. And yet here you are saying that you found evidence that when certain type of people, when they cheat or lie, they'll go maximum no matter what, and there's going to be some people who don't do that, I guess.
Right. So and that's one of the good things about this experiment, is that it allows us to measure. I mean, one of the advantages and disadvantages of using this particular tool is that it allows us to measure this in a very precise, controlled environment. Now, of course, that's also one of the limitations, right? Because we're measuring the norm about this very particular environment. Mm-hmm. Now, we see this as like a starting point in a research agenda. So individuals who have deontic type norms, so it's more about the type of the individual and classified according to the perception of the norms that determines the extent of the lying.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. And and with experiments, it's a type of tool that allows us to control the environment that our particular subjects and students are in, which allows you to measure this particular type of behavior. Now, my curiosity is, how far do you think we can generalize from this particular experiment? Because I use experiments too, and I'm very cautious about saying things like, making general statements about what we can say about human behavior. And oftentimes I hear myself making a very strong caveat, like, in this particular market environment that I have, here's what I found. Now, if you believe what we have done, then these are the things I could say, but that's the only thing I could say. I can't go any further.
That's a great question, and as you know, we experimentalists, we face that question all the time. Like about the external validity or the generalizability of our experimental results. Now, I think this question is overemphasized for experiments, and particularly for lab experiments, because I think this question applies to any type of empirical research. Now, having said that, I think in the end, the true question or the true answer to this question is an empirical matter, in the sense that we need more type of experiments to try to more experiments along similar lines to try to explore the edge of the validity, or like how well these experiments replicate in different circumstances and in different situations. Now, in that sense, it's not different from other lines of empirical research. People using field experiments, they face the same the same question or the same problem. If you do a randomized control trial of deworming or giving books to kids in a village in Africa, does that extend to the U.S., to Latin America? Does that same relationship will still hold in 20 years? That is an empirical question that
right.
We don't know. What we can say is if we have our methods that are adequate and properly implemented, we should have at least internal validity regarding the results that really apply to the particular context that we're studying. But the external validity question, I think it's a very important question that we need to run more experiments and more data in order to be able to provide a better answer.
Right. So right now our conversation turned a little bit away from your own research into just in general about experimental economics. Now I understand that when you were here at George Mason, you were also working with Vernon Smith, one of our great hero, Nobel Prize winner of economics in 2002, I believe. What was it like working with him? And also, were you here when he won the award?
Yes. So I was here when he received the award. And I did work with him during my dissertation, and I'm currently working with him right now on a project. And it's it's very exciting. It's a great humbling experience because I think because Vernon is a very deep thinker.
Yes.
And
he's a wide reader too.
Wide reader.
He has a physics background from
Yes.
Caltech, so he's a smart guy. But not just that. From what I hear, he read philosophy, a whole bunch of things when he was, even before he became a PhD. I know he was already reading, and I'm just like, I don't have, how do you find all this time to make connections across different disciplines and all of that?
That's exactly right. He has read in so many disciplines that it's amazing, it's impressive, but I think that gives him a very, very deep perspective and a different angle.
Yeah.
When someone who has just been trained in economics, looks at results from an experiment, I think you see that differently than people who have a more interdisciplinary background. And that's definitely his case, in addition for, that he's really smart and a deep thinker. So in that sense, it's very encouraging, and it gives a different opportunity to learn about how to interpret results and how to do research. But at the same time, it's very humbling because such a smart and well-recognized person is willing to listen and discuss and exchange ideas with anyone. So that is very humbling.
No, that's right. I've also met. I've never actually personally spoken to Vernon, but of course I see him from afar, and he's been to George Mason a few times for various events over the years. And every time I see him from afar, it's as if there's some sort of a halo around him, and everybody gravitates towards him, and everybody wants to hear what his thoughts are, and he's open to all of them. So I'm not actively part of the conversation. This is when I was a grad student. I'm even more sort of scared, right, to speak to someone who's oh my God, he's at the forefront of our field. But just listening to him speak to everyone and give his thoughts, it was one of those things where I was wow, I had no idea. It was amazing and impressive and awesome to see him to spend all that time entertaining all sorts of questions and all sorts of topics.
That's right, what you said. And what's even more impressive is that he's not only willing to entertain questions and give his thoughts, but he's very genuinely interested in listening to what people have to say. So, he loves to attend Liberty Fund conferences, but he's genuinely interested in hearing, the perspectives from other participants from different disciplines. So in that sense, that's kind of what I was trying to get at when I said that it was a humbling experience, because you have this very smart person, very deep thinker, very recognized, willing to give time and listen to my thoughts for a few minutes. That's very humbling.
Yeah, and it's actually, and so watching him and along with other professors here at George Mason, just see them have such a wide perspective. It was very, very new and also odd experience for me because I did econ undergrad. I went into undergrad knowing that I wanted to do econ, and after I did that, I went straight to master's econ. I went straight. So I had a very sort of like a straight arrow path to my academic career, and for Vernon and also listen to Pete Becky and other people talk about like this is how we think about economics. It's not about like cost benefit analysis. It's about human behavior. We got to consider it very seriously. I was just like, whoa, like mind blown. Like it was just a very odd, eye-opening experience once I came to Mason for them to be talking about what DeAndre McCloskey calls the humanomics, right? Like the human portion of economics.
Yeah. And you're right. I think that the domain of economics is much wider than at least the perception of what traditional economics is about. And I think it's also growing and it's interacting more with other disciplines, with psychology, with sociology, with anthropology, and that's very exciting. It's turning more and more towards a conversation with other branches of the social sciences.
No, that's right. Conversations is one of the most important things, I think, in terms of advancing our ideas and pushing the forefront of all disciplines. I wanted to actually return a little bit back to Vernon himself. What would you say is his biggest influence on you? Like I know he by example he has shown you and many others what it's like to be a good scholar, a good colleague, and a good teacher. But I'm wondering what his specific influence would be on you in shaping the type of economist that you have become.
Wow, that's a good question. So let me put 2 or 3 ways in I think that he has influenced me. One is just, first of all, his work ethic. He's 91 years old and he still shows up every day at 6 a.m. at the office, unless he's traveling, for giving talks funds. Or conferences or Liberty Funds, right? So that is, the passion for his work and his research. That's just an example of something that I try to emulate. The second is, as I mentioned before, the deep way in which he looks at experimental results that goes beyond just saying sometimes I see, or at least initially in my career, used to see a result and say this is, I don't know what, this is unexpected, so that's strange.
Let's put it aside.
He would, look seriously and deeply at that and say okay, why is this turning out the way it is? And running experiments is a humbling experience because many times you think, okay, I'm gonna run this experiment and I'm gonna see these results and these differences, and then you get a very different result than you originally expected, and in that sense it's humbling. But if you engage with the data and look at it and try to genuinely understand that it's individuals, human beings making decisions, it forces you to give a deep thought into the fundamentals behind the behavior and the results that you're looking at.
No, so my experience is also very much like that too, right? Like I use a trust game as the second task, and the first task it's a market game that's but it's a variant of an existing market that other experimentalists are more familiar with, and as a result of that, I don't get super crisp, clean results, right? Like not one, it's like this is exactly what we set out to find. This is exactly what we find. On the fringes, there's some messiness that's going on, and when I would give presentations, sometimes people would be curious about that messiness, but other times some of the experimentalists in the crowd would be like, look, that's not, that's messiness. That probably means that your design was flawed and at some level, so ignore that. Let's talk about this crisp set of results that you found. And it was, as a graduate student, like I look up to all these PhDs and professors, so I used to not question that, right? When they were just like, these are the things that we focus on, these are the things that we don't focus on after experiments have happened. But once I got, I graduated and I was in the job market and all of that, it became a point of frustration for me, because that was the point. That was the entire point that I wanted to make. It's like, look, here are things. We see that people recognize trustworthy people. People recognize untrustworthy people. They react to it by trusting trustworthy people and not trusting untrustworthy people. But let's talk about the middle, when people don't really know what these people are like and what strangers are like. And they're just like, no, I was like, I want to talk about that. Like, can we talk about that? It's like, no. And that was like, a deep source of frustration, but at the same time I understood that that's how the discipline operated, and that if I wanted to have a conversation about that I had to actually change my sort of venue a little bit, where they're willing to talk about all sorts of things. And with there are a few places like that, and of course Mercatus is one of them. So so it's needless to say, one of the best places in the world. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, when I was choosing to come to Mason, it was like a very clear sort of progression. I went from, as an econ major at Emory, I went to NYU for a master's, and it was at my master's program at NYU where I encountered William Easterly, and he sort of recommended George Mason to me, and that's how I came here. So there was a natural sort of progression to why George Mason for me, right? But how about you? I understand you did business and finance as an undergraduate, so you have a similar, related, but a different discipline, a set of disciplines from economics. So what made you choose econ, and what made you choose George Mason?
So in my undergrad, I was originally started with econ, and kind of in the middle I switched because I was not very satisfied with the econ program at the time, but I was still taking econ courses and going way beyond what was required for me to learn more about econ. And eventually I said, okay, this is really my passion, this is what I want to do, and that's when I decided to go to grad school and do econ. And then I chose George Mason initially. So I didn't, unlike you, I didn't have a very straight path, or I didn't follow a very straight path. So I came to GMU. I was interested in Austrian and public choice.
Right. So because you also did your undergrad at Francisco Marroquin,
yes.
Where they do a lot of reading of Hayek and Mises and everyone.
Yes. And one of the things that happened to me is that actually I got exposed to different areas of economics here that I was not exposed at Francisco Marroquin. So that was kind of like why my path was not all that straight. So then I started getting into, I started a little bit exploring monetary economics, and then I discovered experimental economics, and that just really captivated me. Then, I started doing lab experiments. For a while, I started doing field experiments. I got interested in that. So my path has been very windy, but it's been, personally satisfying in terms of at least my curiosity.
No, with the winding path though, one of the things that I thought, and I think a lot of prospective and even current grad students might think, is that if you're pursuing a graduate study, everything is a straight path. You know exactly what you're doing, and you know what to do, what not to do. But that's something that ex post I realized that a lot of us end up doing. There's a lot of windy path, and in fact it ends up being more satisfying because you explore more things, and by the time you choose what your dissertation topic will be, that's the thing. You've already sort of just you already explored many different topics, different fields within economics, and once you choose that, it's something that I don't know about you, but I stuck with working with morality and sociality of markets ever since I'm graduated. Like, I'm not out many years from PhD, but I foresee all the projects that I'm already thinking of and already part of. I mean, it's my dissertation topic, like all the way down. So it's actually super encouraging also to hear that you had this winding path too, and probably also encouraging for a lot of other graduate students to hear like it's totally okay, guys, to take a windy path, to take a little bit longer than what a lot of the professors and their fellow students might say.
Yeah, it's okay. If I can give some advice, at least some advice to my younger self, I would say take a very extreme winding path, but try to do that as early as possible. So if you can do that before grad school, that would be ideal. So when you go to grad school, your path will be a lot more straight, but you will have sampled more of the different fields, approaches, or even different areas of social sciences. So you'll have more certainty to why you want to head in that path. So that's some advice I would try to give. And then perhaps the other advice is sample not just different branches of economics and social sciences, but also try to learn different tools and try to have a very versatile tool set to try to be able to tackle different problems from different angles.
That's actually a really important point, because a lot of us, especially for us who use quantitative methods, we tend to stick to one method, right? Granted, it makes a lot of sense. We're more familiar with it. We know it better. We've been trained in it. So it's not surprising that we end up doing that. But one of the things that Eleanor Ostrom tried to emphasize, and one of the frustrations that many of us here experience, is the unwillingness to be flexible about the methodology and not to be to think that one particular method is superior over another, and that is the only and true way to address some of the questions that we have.
Exactly, I agree. We should think of different methodological approaches as different tools or different tool sets, and some tools are more appropriate to tackle a particular question or a particular problem, or at least give a different perspective on it. So I think the different methodological approaches and different tools, I see them more as complements than as substitutes. We tend to, as you were saying, we tend to follow a particular methodological tool, which is the one we're most familiar with, and tend to see that as this superior methodology, and everything else is a imperfect substitute of this. I think we should take a broader approach and see them as more as complements than as substitutes.
So we're here. It's nice and early in the morning. It's something like 8:05. We started our conversation at 7:30 in the morning. We're actually here for a colloquium on culture, and to have a discussion on how we should think about culture, how we can sort of study culture in economics and sociology and different disciplines. You and I have chosen to use experiments to study culture and its various aspects. The question I want to ask is, what other methods do you think we can use in order to explore a little bit more about culture? Maybe not perfectly, it might be imperfect, right? We need to admit that I think one of the things that hubris of scholars is that we tend to not want to admit that there are some pitfalls to our methodology, that we're not able to make sweeping claims about culture. But we sometimes do fall into that and talk about how one study or one series of studies might say about a whole variety of cultures. So what other methods do you think we can think about using in order to imperfectly study culture, or maybe perfectly study culture?
That's a good question. So I think culture is very important. It has gained more attention in economics, in the past few decades, but it's still an underexplored topic.
Right.
I think we have a lot to learn from anthropologists, cultural anthropologists who are doing real work exploring, the extreme variation in cultures that one can see in small scale societies. I try to use experimental methods, as you mentioned, to try to explore that. But I think that's probably just we're just scratching the surface. Mm-hmm. And I think as more people try to think about how to use different methods, this will become more prevalent. So, for instance, I think agent-based modeling could be another way of trying to study culture.
Oh yeah, because we definitely cannot watch an evolution of culture in a short amount of time. I mean, we probably need to encapsulate ourselves and time travel and all of that. So you're absolutely right. Like agent-based modeling would be one of them. And then I actually was thinking that some of the other ones that we could think of that, since you mentioned anthropologists, there's ethnographies that we can tap into to investigate how cultures evolve and how that's impacting people's economic and non-economic decisions.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you can, I think the way you put it, you can use ethnographic methods to try to zoom in a particular culture and try to explore its richness. While you can use other types of methods to kind of like zoom out and try to see, like the variation or, like the big picture, like ignoring sort of like the richness in the details, right? So it depends on what kind of perspective you want to.
No, that's right. And I think it might also be dictated by the types of questions that you're asking, right? Like maybe all you want to see is how are different cultures different in this aspect, in which case you don't really, I mean, I guess you could have a fuller, richer story by doing ethnographies, but that doesn't necessitate such a study. Maybe you can just use an experiment, or maybe you can just use existing econometric sort of models and data to investigate all of that. Or maybe what you really want to know is, hey, let's figure out how this particular institution has emerged from this type of environment. If we can have a better understanding of that, then maybe, just maybe, we can have a better understanding of why it's not working over there, or things like that.
Yeah, that's right. So in this sense, I think also anthropologists have started using tools of economics. So they use quantitative analysis, regressions, but you also have like anthropologists like Joe Henrich doing experiments in small scale societies. Hillard Kaplan also uses experiments. He's an anthropologist that uses experiments to try to explore how people behave regarding health decisions. So again, as I was saying, I think this kind of rich interdisciplinary conversation is really important, and that there's a lot to learn from other areas of the social sciences.
No, that's absolutely right, and I don't. There are the unfortunate part is not only in economics, but and also this other disciplines, we don't encourage that kind of discussion to happen all that often. And we might, for instance, call something interdisciplinary, but it ends up being dominated by a particular discipline, so the conversations turn a certain way, which then sort of disinterests people who are not of that discipline, that conversation, and they sort of, so there's a natural sort of type of forces that happen, right? Like we might, that ends up being a certain type of conversation as opposed to a true interdisciplinary conversation.
Yeah, that's right. And I think especially like in conventional mainstream economics, it's more difficult to appreciate what you can learn from other disciplines, and I'm just assuming that that's gonna be similar like in the mainstream of this other disciplines. But as you move a little bit towards the edge or towards the fringe, then I think it's you get a little bit of this more rich environment where you're able to talk to people from other disciplines more as equals, as partners, instead of seeing them as a like a more quote-unquote primitive discipline or primitive area of the social sciences.
Right. If you could inspire, I'm sure you definitely inspire younger graduate students and all of that, but if you could really dictate the types of questions that they should be exploring, or questions that you think are sorely underexplored and you wish to see sometime in the future being discussed and everything in journals and all that, what might be some of them?
Okay, so what questions they should be exploring? I think they should be exploring the questions that really interest them and they're really passionate about. The type of questions that I'm really interested about right now, it's I'm trying to explore norms as a particular aspect of culture and how that influences institutions, especially formal institutions. So I think norms lie at the heart of formal institutions. So we know that institutions are really important, but we have less knowledge about what determines institutions, how institutions change and evolve, and that we know that they change through time, but what are the micro mechanisms that allow them to change, and what are the underpinning aspects of them, how social norms or how aspects outside of the main economic variables affect institutions. So let me give you an example. So we know that institutions, are rules. Those rules tend to be enforced by individuals, but what motivates an individual to enforce a rule and to apply sanctions when they need to be applied, right? I'm thinking of formal rules, a formal institution. Now you can say, well, there's another rule that forces this person to enforce and sanction the rule. But again, that's just pushing the question back one level, right? In the end, you're stuck with the question, okay, but who guards the guardians, right? So in the end, there has to be some aspect of culture, norms, values, or moral beliefs that forces an individual to enforce a rule, even when it's costly for them to do so, or when they would prefer to shirk and not exert effort to enforce a rule. Now, this has been recognized by many people.
No, so actually, you are touching on something that I'm also interested in, and things that I'm like whenever I see it mentioned, and like who polices the police. Whenever
Yes.
that kind of topic arises in mass media and popular media, I'm just like like that's an interesting question. But something about that question always bugged me, right? And I think one of the things that we need to also consider is that we don't need a specific group of people like who we see as authority policing the police, right? Like we can think about it as we as individuals, as citizens of these countries that we live in, we can also keep them accountable. We can tell them through various methods, for instance, through news, our sort of and other activities. We can also be telling authority, members of authority, to say, look, we're not okay with the types of decisions that you've made. Of course, we don't know the smaller decisions that we made, but we see like the sort of the general flavor, right, of and the general tone of the different rules that we have created. So I think it's really important, and that your research is really important to speak to how internally we can induce, or we can sort of encourage change to the rules of the games, the institutions that we live in.
Right, and I think you brought a very good example, right? So, police here are, they should act according to certain formal rules. Now, recently it's become evident of different series of abuses by the police on different domains. But those are not just happening randomly. There are sets of values and social norms that lie behind those types of abuses, why those abuses are protected instead of being persecuted. So that's kind of like what I'm trying to get at, or why I think studying social norms is important, because in the end that's what determines what type of formal institutions are implemented, and like what type of informal institutions or informal rules end up being applied, even when they contradict the formal rules or the formal institutions.
That's absolutely right. And most importantly, it's not just the formal rules that shape our conduct and behavior and decisions. It's also the people that we talk to, the fear that we have, for instance, right, that our friends might not like us anymore, right, if we do a certain thing. So those, many right, different factors, not just sort of like the way we traditionally think about as economic incentives. Those are not the only things that are shaping our behavior. And obviously, those micro steps and those micro decisions that every individual is making, that's important, because that will, on aggregate, direct the way and the direction in which our culture, our institutions, our country is going to go down.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and I think you're right. I think the role of the informal institutions, is really important. Not only when you go to developing countries that have weak or even absent formal rules, but even in developed economies, as we were talking about with the example of the police, right? They have very explicit rules, but a lot of those rules are simply ignored, and ignoring the rules seems to be okay, or seems to be allowed or socially acceptable, at least on some dimensions amongst the police.
No, that's right. I grew up in Indonesia, and I was living there when Suharto was in power, and watched sort of his downfall. I guess that's how I would put it. The attitude that the police had before and after is completely different, and I attribute that to not only the latitude that the government was giving them, but it's also the way that the citizens were seeing them, right? Like under Suharto, they were essentially part of the military, so they were very afraid to sort of counter them, because they realized, like, crap, they're part of the military. They have immense physical power to really stop me from doing things and to really inflict harm upon me. So they had a lot of fear against the police. And now once the Asian crisis happened, and once Suharto was no longer the president, and all of that, you could see the citizens slowly changing their perspective and their sort of interpretation of what police is allowed to do and not. And there's now a lot of pushback from this on the side of the citizens. There's also a lot of a very explicit discontent about the way police is behaving. So now the police is also behaving differently. They seem to be moving towards more of a what a police would you would traditionally think a police would do, as opposed to them being a surrogate of a dictatorship's military.
I see. Yeah, that's interesting, because I think you're talking about, or the way at least I interpret this, is sort of like what explains the dynamics and changes and shifts in norms and values, or we can call it culture more generally, right? Which is a profound question that needs detailed answers.
No, that's right. The main takeaway I have today from our conversation is that there's multiple and alternative solutions to understanding human behavior and how we can actually shape them, right? Like we traditionally and we sort of conventionally like to think there's only top-down solutions, but there's also bottom-up solutions, and it's not just authority figures or their tools that can hold people accountable. We ourselves, as citizens, individuals who we popularly think not to have not so much power, collectively we do, and we can actually make sure that we hold our own leaders, national leaders, accountable. Well, I think we're close to that time, so thank you so much, Diego, for joining us on this wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.